Okay, so Carlos, my question is this, because listening to the presentation from your side, it seems like it's the Old Testament on one side, it's the disciples on one side, and then it's Paul on the other side, and those influenced by Paul, such as Mark, because you seem to be citing Paul a lot for your viewpoint regarding clean foods. But the thing is, though, for example, Acts chapter 15, James gives the decree. So when it comes to like blood, for example, so really even Christians today should be having halal or kosher because we slaughter the way where the blood goes out. But putting that aside, in that decree, which the Holy Spirit agrees to, you cannot have food sacrificed to idols, as mentioned. Now, you mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 that Paul said, oh, it's okay, idols are nothing. But this seems to be Paul backtracking, because in front of the disciples, Paul is observant under the Mosaic law, but then in his own letters, which he's sending to Gentile churches, he has a different message. This is why in Acts chapter 21, James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, he puts Paul on the spot to prove that he's still following the law of Moses, and he makes him do a sacrifice, and Paul does do the sacrifice. So the point is, according to the disciples in Acts chapter 15, there are still food laws that Paul seems to be going against. And one last text I want to cite to prove my point that not all foods are clean is Isaiah chapter 66, where eating swine in the end times is likened with eating rats and detestable things. So according to Isaiah, even in the latter times, the latter days, so that's these days, not Old Testament times, eating pig is an abomination and a detestable thing. So could you explain why Paul went against the Jerusalem Council and how there can be all foods being clean when Isaiah says that even in the latter times, eating swine and rats are likened with abominations?
Right, so a lot. So Isaiah 65, 66, we believe that it refers to the coming kingdom. So it's conditions in the first stage of the kingdom, which we call the millennium, based from Revelation 20. There will be a temple during that period, but not for the church. They are for the Israelites. And I believe those types of prophecies, like Isaiah 66, Zechariah 14, where even the nations have to go up and keep certain festivals. So that's for the nations. That's not for Christians, the church. We will have been raised from the dead. If you were alive at that time when Jesus came back, you're transformed into an immortal body, immortal person, and the dead Christians will be raised to life to rule over the nations, which would include a restored Israel, restored Egypt, restored Assyria. Read Isaiah 19 for that. And that's what I call the widescreen gospel. When it comes to Paul, yes, Paul goes beyond the council's verdict. I mean, 1 Corinthians chapters 8 to 10, to me, is very clear. He's going beyond. So why does Paul go beyond? Well, he has greater knowledge. Then he rebukes, for example, Peter in Galatians chapter 2, as you know. In Acts 21, it's true, almost 10 years after the council verdict, when his last journey, I believe, to Jerusalem in Acts 21, James, was it? Or the others say, hey, listen, Paul, we have so many Jewish Christians here, believers, and they're saying you're teaching our children not to get circumcised, to apostatize is the Greek word there for Moses, right? And I think what Paul does is similar to what Jesus himself does in the Gospels. If you remember, there was an episode in Matthew where I think Peter comes to Jesus and says, hey, listen, the temple priests are here. They want their temple money. And that was a law. In the law of Moses, there was a payment. And Jesus says, so we do not offend them. Go and get a fish, and inside the fish is a coin, if you know that story. So Jesus there is employing what I believe is a diplomacy. He's employing diplomacy at that point, and that's what Paul does as well in Acts 21. So as not to, and get killed, although he almost got killed anyway.
So it's interesting, Carlos, that you said that Paul is going beyond, when in reality what you mean, or what the logical conclusion is Paul is going against the conclusion of Acts chapter 15, which was agreed by the Holy Spirit as well. And the fact that James tested Paul in Acts chapter 21 means that the law is still binding on Jews. Gentiles is a gray area. You can go back and forth. But at least Jews, and Paul was a Jew, so the law was still binding on him. Now,
Well, hold on. If I could say, it's not a gray area when it comes to us Gentiles. Acts 21, I quoted the verse, right? Whoever is speaking there says, we have already concluded this matter when it comes to Gentiles, right? So that's not a gray area.
so Paul went against that then, where when he, in 1 Corinthians 8, he said that idols are nothing, you can eat food, when the Holy Spirit sanctified what James said in Acts 15.
Yes, so Paul, you have to say, is either a false apostle, which many do, and some Christians do, by the way. We've met Christians who believe Paul is a false apostle.
Jewish Christians believe that as well.
Right, and I've met Gentile Christians who believe he's a false apostle because they want to keeping Sabbath, etc. But for most of us Christians, we see that Paul goes ahead of the apostles themselves, and as you know in Galatians, he even rebukes Peter for being a hypocrite. So,
Now, my second question is regarding John chapter 5. I believe that Carlton is correct that John is expressing the views, the thoughts that the Pharisees had. Now, how you try to respond to that is, the first thing is you said that Carlton was adding things in. It doesn't say the Pharisees' thoughts, but the context makes it clear. But in the same way, then you try to explain away the equal to God part, because you should be a Trinitarian if you take it straightforward. But you try to say that that means in authority, etc. But the point is, your interpretation to explain what Jesus was doing when it comes to the Sabbath, like healing on it, is that Jesus claimed to be the Lord of the Sabbath. But if you actually read Mark chapter 2, Jesus is not saying that he himself is the Lord of the Sabbath. He says that man was not made for Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. Therefore, so for this reason, man is master of the Sabbath. If you take it back into the Aramaic, the word is the same all three times. So man was not made for Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. Therefore, man is master of the Sabbath. So what he was trying to say to the Pharisees is, your rigid interpretation of the Sabbath, where you're trying to rebuke me for doing these good deeds, is incorrect. And if you actually go back to Pharisaic sources, they had their own debates on these issues, and even today, many rabbis they have ambulance services on the Sabbath. So that was an intra-Jewish debate. That doesn't mean that Jesus was abrogating the Sabbath. It means he was going against a certain interpretation of the Sabbath. Now, this is proven by Matthew's gospel as well, because in Matthew chapter 5 has Jesus affirming all the laws. In Matthew 23, he tells his disciples that listen to what the Pharisees say, don't do what they do. But in Mark chapter 13, when Jesus speaks about the abomination time, Mark has Jesus say that about fleeing in the winter. Matthew adds an extra line to that in Matthew chapter 24, that be in fear about fleeing in the winter and on the Sabbath. So Matthew clearly believed that the Sabbath was still in vogue. So could you...
do Muslims keep the Sabbath?
No, Muslims keep
So
the
why
Sabbath.
are you defending Sabbath keeping?
That's because for Muslims, though, the law changed with the coming of Prophet Muhammad and the Quran, the Sharia. Yeah. But before that, we believe that the Jews and Christians are supposed to follow the law of Moses. So before Islam, the Sabbath was still in vogue.
Right,
Yeah,
but you don't keep the Sabbath. You
No,
don't care
we
for
don't
the
keep
Sabbath. But you're defending Sabbath keeping.
Yeah, because I'm speaking about, from your perspective,
Okay.
following the Bible, the Sabbath is still valid.
Okay, let me try and, you're saying a lot. So Matthew 5, you said, I think Jesus affirmed the law of Moses. In Matthew 5, Sermon on the Mount?
The Sermon on the Mount.
Everyone knows he's contrasting. You have heard it said, but I say, that's a contrast.
Yeah,
He's not affirming.
if you actually read biblical scholarship on this, a lot of what Jesus
I have read biblical scholarship.
a lot of the contrast that Jesus says are actually there in rabbinic sources.
Okay, so you have heard it say an eye for an eye, but I say love your enemies, period. End of discussion.
Yeah.
Even Nehemiah Gordon, have you heard of Nehemiah Gordon?
Yes,
He had issues with that, and you know what he said to me? He said, oh, that's not what Matthew said. So he implied corruption to the text because he couldn't handle Matthew 5 verses 44 following.
You see, a lot of the laws in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says that, for example, you have heard eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I say do this. Those values are there in the Old Testament, so you can. That doesn't abrogate the Old Testament.
What about the certificate of divorce in Matthew 19? Moses gave you a certificate of divorce, but I say, or now I say, is that changing? Matthew 19? Have you read Matthew 19?
Matthew
19?
A certificate of divorce. I'd have to check.
Now I say to you, whoever, and he changes it. So yeah, check it out, Matthew 19.
Specific one, but in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 to 20, he says that the laws are till heaven and earth pass. But after that time, in Acts 21, the disciples are still following the law. So the disciples would have understood Jesus better than Christians 2,000 years later, for example. So if Jesus abrogated the law of Moses, why are the disciples still following the law of Moses in chapter 21 of Acts and making Paul prove that he's following it?
Yeah, because it's difficult for them. You're talking about millennia, old traditions. That's the only. But I do agree with you. The curtain, as we say on early Christian church, comes down on Jewish Christians still doing, Torah stuff. And Gentiles, to me, that's not a gray area. And to most Christians, as you know, it's not a gray area. Gentiles were not getting by the way, circumcision of the flesh we didn't even get to. That's the gateway to law keeping. You cannot keep the law of Moses without physical circumcision.